Okay, so good evening, everybody. Good morning, Maurice. We are extremely happy to have you this afternoon to give this talk, which is part of the lectures, the regular lectures of the Chair Banque de France PSE on international macro. Part of the audience regularly follows these lectures. So I'm going to briefly introduce you two for the rare people that don't know you already. So Maurice is a professor in economics at University of California, Berkeley. He's also a non-resident fellow at the Peterson Institute of International Economics. And well, he has a very long CV. As you know, he served as the chief economist of the IMF between 2015 and 18. He's a very well-known specialist of international monetary issues, international financial markets, current accounts, imbalances, crisis, and so on. I think you have something like 130 academic papers that were published. It's very impressive, and about 10 books or more. Some of you may know that Maurice Obstfeld is a former PhD student of Rudiger Dornbusch. So for the students who are attending this lecture, this will be, so of course, this is the model they have been suffering on. I saw that your first academic paper actually was in the GIE in 1980. It was about fixed exchange rates. So it's a bit of an irony that today we are going to talk about flexible exchange rates. And so this paper, which is a working paper of the NBR, was written, I think, for the 50th anniversary of Harry Johnson, but this was not what was asked for. You were just asked to talk at the conference, and then it happened to be the 5th anniversary of Harry Johnson's paper on the case for flexible exchange rates. So this is your starting point, and it helps you to go through several decades of thinking about flexible exchange rates, and this is what we are very interested in today, to listen to you. If I'm correct, Johnson was a Canadian. So although 1969 was before the end of the Bretton Woods system, Canada actually had experienced floating rates for some time during this period. So he had some experience of flexible rates. I'm going to leave you the floor just to tell the audience that if you want to ask questions during the talk, you can use the chat button, the converser, I think, yeah. And at the end, if there will be questions and answers, so you ask your question, you write your question, and we'll try with Francesco. We'll try to carry them to Maury. And then at the end, there will be questions and answers, and there you can raise your hand, and you have to go to the participants, and there is a button, lever la main, or raise your hand, which you can use. Okay, thank you very much again. The floor is yours.
Okay, can everyone hear me well?
Perfectly.
Yes, good, great. Okay, thank you very much for that kind introduction, Agnès. I'm really delighted that there are students listening, because this is very much a history of thought paper, and you'll see that Rudy Dornbusch plays a role here, and Harry Johnson was actually one of his teachers. So, you know, there's a lot of genealogy of international finance in this talk. As Agnès said, this is actually the annual Harry Johnson lecture, which is given at the Money, Macro, and Finance group at the LSE, which Johnson helped found actually in 1969, the same year that he wrote this paper. And unlike most Harry Johnson lectures, this one actually is about Harry Johnson, so it makes it fairly unusual. And one thing I discovered writing this paper, I sort of rediscovered Harry Johnson. He's very little cited today, which is a strange thing given how much he dominated the literature in international and macro, back in the 1960s especially. I sort of encourage everyone to go back and try out some of his writing. He was a very forceful and clear writer, and I learned many interesting things about him, and I'll share a couple of them today. But the main coincidence that struck me when I was invited to give this paper was that it was the golden anniversary of an essay by Harry Johnson, The Case for Flexible Exchange Rates, 1969, which again is not very much read today, but it's was very influential in that period. Johnson was following on the title of Milton Friedman's better known essay called The Case for Flexible Exchange Rates, which Friedman wrote in 1950 when Europe was still struggling to gain current account convertibility for its currencies. This followed an ill-timed attempt by the UK to return to convertibility in 1947. This was done under pressure from the United States. And it reflected a sort of split in the economics profession. A number of economists, including Mead, echoed Friedman's view that flexible rates would be a good way of breaking out of the convertibility impasse. And in fact, Winston Churchill's cabinet briefly considered floating sterling in the 1950s. They decided not to for various reasons. And economists such as Hayek, Robbins, Kindleberger, Nurkse were all very much against the idea of flexible or floating exchange rates. Why did Johnson return to this topic nearly 2 decades later? Well, European convertibility was, of course, reached by the end of the 1950s based on the European Payments Union, and arguably European convertibility also helped set the stage for the type of cooperation that was embodied in the Treaty of Rome and later moves toward economic integration in Europe. The dollar shortage ended, and the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates really was quite successful in restoring international trade, restoring growth, promoting recovery. So Friedman's position was kind of relegated to the academic backwaters. But by later in the 1960s, there were great stresses building in the Bretton Woods system, and it became much more relevant to think about how to reform the international system. And in the light of that, Harry Johnson revisited Friedman's case. And as Agnès said, Canada, which was Johnson's country of origin, was fairly unique in having actually gone rogue in the 1950s through the early 1960s and floated the Canadian dollar. This not only informed Johnson's point of view, but it was the basis for some very critical papers by Robert Mundell, who was also an advisor of Rudy Dornbush at Chicago. And Mundell reached very different conclusions, as I'll discuss in a few moments, from Johnson. But clearly this Canadian experience was very important. Actually, one of the remarkable facts is how many distinguished Canadian international economists there have been, per capita relative to other countries. So let me just focus a moment on Friedman, a Canadian economist who you may not know, Russell Boyer, actually dug the original Friedman typescript out of the Hoover Institution archives, and this has been provided to me by Doug Irwin at Dartmouth. And this is the first page of what Friedman actually wrote in 1950. This was actually written, for the organization that was helping to administer the Marshall Plan in Europe. And he wrote here, and this is actually not in the published version of the manuscript. So what's interesting is he wrote about Keynes here, and he pointed out that Keynes, who had taken trade for granted, open trade for granted in his writings of the 1920s and 30s, had expounded a simple dilemma: fixed exchange rates versus stable internal prices. And Friedman noted that since you could also view the openness of the economy, the degree of restriction on trade and capital account as a decision variable, the dilemma has now become a trilemma. So this is the origin of this famous word trilemma, the first known use within the context of international finance. And in fact, Johnson does not use the word trilemma, and he focuses on trade and not financial openness. But financial openness was really at the heart of the Bretton Woods system's problems and at the heart of Johnson's argument. And this trilemma, therefore, lurks throughout his 1969 paper. Now, another point to mention about Johnson, I don't want to linger too long on this, but that if you read the paper, it's very UK-centric. Johnson, though Canadian, was a professor at the LSE and was a very active participant in UK policy debates. And Johnson's paper followed the 1967 devaluation of sterling by Harold Wilson's Labour government, which was very traumatic for Britain. It followed a long string of balance of payments crises. It was viewed as symbolic of Britain's economic and political decline. If anyone has watched the new season of the British series The Crown, which I assume is available everywhere with Olivia Colman, a big element in some of the episodes is the relationship between Wilson and Queen Elizabeth and the sterling devaluation. So it's dramatized there. And this event, led the Wilson government to seek entry into the then common market. This was not achieved until later under the Heath government. And one of the big issues in the debate over whether Britain should enter the common market was the fear by some in Britain that this would inevitably lead to the UK joining a single European currency, something that was raised in 1969 by the Werner Report. And one thing that seems to be quite forgotten is that within Britain, the academic establishment was very split about the common market. It was not so much split about Brexit. Most reputable British economists were against Brexit. But in terms of the common market, there was a lot of controversy, and not only were economists more on the right of the political spectrum, like Johnson, against it, so were economists like Haldor very much against. So when Johnson wrote the case for flexible exchange rates, he was also implicitly pushing against this idea of a European currency. And he made this explicit later on. At the end of the day, Britain, when it joined the common market, did not join the European snake. And this, with hindsight, is really where one of the fault lines is that led to Brexit. Because, of course, one important issue for the referendum in 2016 was Europe's progression without Britain to actually have a single currency, which greatly complicated the governance of the EU and the role of Britain within that. So this is all, very relevant history for where we are now. Britain was also a reserve currency country, and the devaluation of sterling set off a period of speculation that ended with a complete collapse of the Bretton Woods system. Now, another way in which the paper is very UK-centric is that Johnson simply doesn't discuss a number of important systemic issues that were much debated at the time. The exorbitant privilege of the dollar, inadequate liquidity, the Triffin problem. You won't find those in the paper. And he might have thought that if everyone simply floated, that these would become irrelevant. But in fact, these problems do remain with us even under floating today, though I won't go much into those today. Okay, so what is the balance sheet for this paper in terms of what Johnson got right and what he got wrong? Well, one argument in the paper is that exchange rates, if flexible, would move with fundamentals, and they would adjust predictably to fundamentals. Speculation would actually support these movements, and from today's perspective, we would not agree with this. He felt that if countries did not have to intervene to support fixed exchange rates, then there would be much less rationale for intervention in trade and capital movements. And we know this is not right either. There are competitive pressures, and these may lead to protectionism. Just look at the US in recent history, and intervention in capital accounts by many countries. Think about the macroprudential rationales for intervention on the part of especially emerging markets. He also believed that under a flexible rate system, most countries would peg to a major currency. He doesn't say a lot about developing countries, but he felt that they would benefit from freer trade among major currency areas and would be likely to continue to peg. In this respect, he was actually perhaps too pessimistic about the possibilities of poorer countries floating, because there's been much more of that, although managed floating. Interestingly, if you read the paper carefully, you'll see that Johnson felt that the Phillips curve was alive and well as a menu for policy choice, something that his colleague Milton Friedman was in the process of demolishing. And therefore, he felt that inflation differentials would be a major factor in currency movements. Excuse me. What we've seen is that, in fact, there's been a lot of convergence in inflation among countries. And one reason for this is sort of political economy. Johnson somewhat amusingly thought that central bankers had been elevated in prestige by the fixed rate system because their management of currency crises had made them seem like indispensable technocrats of great power. And he thought that this would disappear if we had floating rates. And in fact, what we have seen in terms of the intellectual development of our profession is that there's an argument for independent central bankers as a way of limiting excessive inflation. This is realized in the independence of central banks in many major economies, the adoption of inflation targeting frameworks worldwide. And this has certainly raised the prestige and power of central bankers, contrary to what Johnson thought. On the other hand, in the current environment, and in fact, since the global financial crisis, a different element of central bank power has been emphasized, which is the central bank's role as a lender of last resort. On the other hand, in the zero interest rate world, we've come to question the ability of central banks to actually manage inflation. And so we're in a very sort of interesting place with the independence and the prestige of central bankers these days. And maybe that's something we can discuss more in the.
Maurice, may I ask you a question about this slide, the previous one?
Yes.
So if I'm correct, after World War II, it was thought that fixed exchange rates would promote trade.
Yes, absolutely.
And why did Johnson suddenly thought that flexible exchange rate would promote trade? So why did this reverse?
Well, the consensus view in the profession after the interwar period and the war was that if you allowed exchange rates to be flexible, then countries would exploit that to gain competitive advantage. And this would lead to retaliation in the form of trade protection. And this is clearly an argument we've seen recently where, President Trump has complained about Europe and other countries, devaluing their currencies in order to gain advantage and push for offsetting tariffs. So that's the kind of dynamic that motivated the arrangements in the Bretton Woods system. On the other hand, the argument that Johnson made, which was not without some empirical support, is if countries had limited reserves and needed to preserve them to maintain their exchange rate pegs, then in the face of trade deficits, they would be inclined to use protective measures in order to improve their trade positions. And of course, that as economists, we don't necessarily believe in that direct link between tariffs and the current account. But again, that's another theme that President Trump has sounded. So he's sort of all over the place with not necessarily consistent positions. But these sort of two competing views were the ones that drove this debate. Okay, now I don't want to come down too hard on Harry Johnson because, in fact, I would say that the glass is more than half full. If you read the paper, it's kind of odd from today's perspective because there's almost no empirics in the paper. It's almost completely free of data. So there's a lot of a priori reasoning, but I think much of it is on the mark. So he argued that flexible rates can reconcile the diverse preferences of governments. Within a currency union, he argued, he tried to counter the claim that currency unions like the U.S. or Canada function quite well with fixed rates. And the argument he made was not a labor mobility argument, but an argument based on fiscal federalism. Now, he almost certainly got this from Peter Kennan, who gave a very famous paper at the University of Chicago on this in 1965, but Johnson makes the case very well. He argued, I think effectively, that the need to have a fixed exchange rate does not in itself impose discipline on policymakers, that they would be inclined to use protective measures rather than to submit themselves to discipline. In other words, they would place the costs on partly on their trade partners. He argued very effectively, I think, that the interwar experience cannot be viewed as an indictment of flexibility because conditions were very chaotic. It's not clear how countries would have responded had they been forced to remain on the gold standard. And we think the weight of academic evidence today is that leaving the gold standard actually helped recovery in the 1930s. He pointed out correctly that currency depreciation per se need not be inflationary if it's done in response to a overvalued currency. It instead prevents deflation. He pointed to the development, the importance of market exchange rates in adjusting to unexpected developments. He previewed that trade could expand under flexible exchange rates, and he doesn't actually use the word insulate in his analysis. So he recognized that foreign disturbances would affect the economy. And in fact, there's this one section of the paper that I think is very important, which is sort of exactly right in putting in perspective what a flexible exchange rate gets you and doesn't get you. And he says in this passage, a flexible exchange rate is not a panacea. It is an extra degree of freedom that loosens the balance of payments constraint. And what it does not remove is the constraint that a country's resources over time are limited. And rather it brings this constraint to bear very, very explicitly. I'll let you look at that for a second. So, Johnson here is very modern in a way in saying, look, whatever your exchange rate regime is, there is an intertemporal budget constraint. And that is sort of the fundamental thing we have to keep an eye on. So this is a very modern sounding sort of position. So I think, if you were going to read take one takeaway lesson from the paper, it would be this. So, one way to think about this whole debate over flexible and fixed exchange rates is to ask, how important is this degree of freedom that Johnson mentions? If it's not important, then maybe you're better off with fixed exchange rates. If it is important, flexible exchange rates might seem to be the right answer. And of course, this is a matter of degree. It's a matter of empirics. It's a matter of the characteristics of the economy. It's not an absolute choice between one regime or the other, which is why we do see so many mixed managed floating regimes. But one way to think about a lot of international finance, a lot of the thought in international finance over the decades, in fact, over the last century, since roughly the end of World War II, is to ask how important is this degree of freedom and what answers have economists made. So that's what I want to go through in the next part of this talk. Clearly at the beginning of the post-war period, the consensus view is fixed rates would be better. There's a very nice chapter by Doug Irwin in a volume by Lamoureux and Shapiro from Yale University Press on the Bretton Woods Agreement. And I would argue that since World War II, you can identify at least 10 variants of the argument that flexible exchange rates have important drawbacks and may be dominated by other considerations. And I looked at 6 of these about 2 decades ago in a paper. And if you take these together, you might conclude that fixed exchange rates might be better. Now, what I want to argue today is that 50 years after Johnson, the case for some form of flexible exchange rates is still very much alive. So let me just stop and see if anyone wants to come in with a question at this point, because it's a good breaking point. And if not, I'll go through my 10 variants. Okay, I'm not.
Oh yeah, I had a question about the trilemma actually, because
Yes.
initially you said that there's a Friedman's trilemma between fixed exchange rates, stable prices, and trade. And then you said Johnson thought it was more financial openness. And we have in mind the Mundell trilemma. So could you maybe explain to us these various versions of the trilemma and what are the differences?
Yeah. Well, I think the you know, let's put Mundell aside because there's nothing very original there. I don't think there's really any daylight between Johnson and Mundell. You know, Friedman thought that one way to reconcile internal stability with exchange rate stability was by limiting international trade and international payments more generally. And you know, in sort of the modern world of high capital mobility, we view the trilemma as more a trade-off between internal stability, exchange rate stability, and international capital mobility, because the volume of international financial transactions is so much greater than that of trade transactions. Johnson, you know, is sort of not entirely focused on trade versus capital movements. He's probably more focused on trade. But in the background, one of the big issues that was leading to instability in the Bretton Woods system was this gradual increase in international capital mobility, which was driven in part by the expansion of trade because it gave more scope for disguised capital movements. Although it's also the case that, you know, there were some measures in the 60s which expanded the scope for longer term capital movements. So you know, the main difference reading Friedman is he's mainly focused on trade, and when he talks about speculation, he's thinking about speculation within the foreign exchange market, you know, with some sort of limited ability to you know, for leads and lags. And this had just become much more extensive by the time of Johnson. You know, today it's extremely extensive and is sort of a central issue in thinking about the trilemma. So, you know, I don't think there's a huge difference in the concept, but the difference is in the, you know, in the terms of the third leg of the trilemma, which is, you know, putting blockages in international payments. You know, those were very extensive in Friedman's day, and today they're quite limited. But there's still an option, and that's especially true in the case of emerging markets. So I hope that clarifies the trilemma.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
So I didn't see any question coming out, so I think you can continue.
Okay, so the first, probably historically first variant of a critique is elasticity pessimism. And I call this the thing that would not die because it's like a zombie that keeps coming back from the grave again and again. So that's why I put this picture here. It actually is something that was a concept discussed in the 1930s. There was a belief that trade elasticities were very low, so that an exchange rate depreciation would not get you much in terms of balance of payments adjustment. And the phrase comes from Fritz Machlup, the Austrian economist who taught at Princeton and later at NYU. You know, famously, both Machlup and Guy Orcutt, who was a Yale econometrician who did this 1950 paper at the IMF in the research department, showed how various econometric biases could make estimated trade elasticities spuriously low. By the way, Guy Orcutt, I found out in a somewhat embarrassing moment for me, is the grandfather of Emi Nakamura, who won the Clark Medal 2 years ago. So that's an interest. My colleague at Berkeley. That's an interesting genealogical footnote. But these were very important critiques, and in fact, trade elasticities seem to be reasonably high. And in a paper with some co-authors, including Rob Feenstra and Katie Russ, Phil Luck, we sort of looked at some of these issues. It still remains a relevant concern, but it keeps coming up. So, one sort of indicator of the view of the profession was the 1948 survey that Lloyd Metzler did for the American Economic Association, which is a great survey. Here's Metzler and a friend pictured. And, this quotation from Metzler illustrates the sort of state of play as of the late 1940s, that, movements of exchange rates are not really efficient in allocating resources because short-term elasticities are so very low. And even today, this keeps coming back. This is a one story from the Financial Times from 2015, which you can go look at for an example of how not to do empirical research. They include the benefits of depreciation on exports may have evaporated. So I would say that this is a debate that goes on, but it's probably been exaggerated over the years. An almost diametrically opposite view is what I call extreme purchasing power parity. Now, this was pushed very strongly by the Canadian economists Ronald McKinnon and Mundell. Here, Mundell is pictured in a younger incarnation as a professor at Chicago, basically, this view states that you can't change real exchange rates very much with policy. Now, this requires very high elasticities, a lot of trade arbitrage, and is very counter to the facts. So why Mundell and McKinnon believe this is not totally ever been clear to me. But of course, Mundell concluded from this that exchange rates should be fixed. And in particular, he pushed for fixed exchange rates within Europe. So he's viewed as one of the intellectual founders of the common currency, rightly or wrongly. But this view, in my mind, has very little empirical support.
There was a question on this
Yes.
by Cristina Elena Pinto de Melo, saying that it's not purchasing power parity. In this case, it's competitive. So what's the competitive power parity? So I suppose cost parity instead of purchasing parity. Is there, in this literature, is there some difference that is made between the two concepts?
Not, it's sort of hard to characterize this view. Maybe purchasing power parity is not the right way to do it, but it's a view that's sort of McKinnon called it global monetarism, and it's just very odd. But there's not a lot of theoretical basis for this, but it is basically, it is based on the idea of international competition keeping costs in line and therefore keeping prices in line, in a world of where we don't think a lot about imperfect competition or pricing to market or any of those real world features. So I don't really have a better answer for that, and I'm trying to be fairly dismissive of this view because it's a view by reputable economists, but it doesn't have a strong theoretical or empirical basis. So I hope that's a good enough answer.
So there are two questions about China, but I suppose we will talk about that later on because emerging countries were not emerging at that time.
Let's leave China submerged for the moment and come back to China. Great. Another view that was popular in the early 80s, late 70s was the view of real wage rigidity. And this actually was an element in the debate over European, the costs of a European common currency in terms of stabilization. Two of the signal papers were by Branson and Rothenberg, and also by Sachs. This is Bill Branson in his Princeton study. And the idea here is that, and the best paper on this is Sachs, 1980, in the QJE, that, if you have rigid real wages, if workers demand that their real wages compensate for any terms of trade deterioration due to currency depreciation, then monetary policy will not be useful for stabilization. And so you might as well have fixed exchange rates. And this was viewed as particularly applicable to Europe in that context, at a time when labor market rigidities were even, and unionization was even more important than it is today. And it's probably the case that if you took this to an extreme, you would sort of assume that a single European currency, with a jointly floating exchange rate for all of these rigid wage countries wouldn't work either. But this would contradict what we've seen about the effectiveness of the ECB. So I think this argument has sort of fallen by the wayside. I think much more durable has been the notion of pricing to market, and this is associated with some initial papers by Paul Krugman and especially Rudy Dornbusch, who is pictured here. For those students studying the Dornbusch model, this picture captures the man quite well, to my mind. But in a 1987 paper, Dornbusch put forward this idea that exchange rate pass-through could be limited if there are frictions between countries which prevent equalization of prices measured in a single currency. The intellectual background for this was the sharp dollar depreciation after 1985, the Plaza Accord, which seemed to affect the U.S. current account deficit perversely. And the Dornbusch 87 model, great paper, should all read, would kill the relationship between currencies and the terms of trade in the short run. Krugman had a paper as well. And, the fantastic handbook chapter by Ariel Burstein and Gita Gopinath looks at some of the research on this. What's unclear is the horizon over which exporters practice pricing to market, and whether, over the longer term, the exchange rate nonetheless does promote adjustment. And here there is debate. This is Paul Krugman, as you probably recognize. And Paul, in addition to writing one of the first papers on pricing to market, also put forward the view, together with Richard Baldwin and Avinash Dixit, that sunk costs in international trade could slow adjustment. So there are some classic papers, and the basic idea is that, if there are sunk costs and entry and exit from the traded goods sector is subject to those, and there's uncertainty, then the amount of depreciation or appreciation you would need to actually make resources move between traded and non-traded sectors could be quite big, and that would limit the effectiveness of perhaps moderate exchange rate changes. Interestingly, Paul in 1991 wrote a very nice essay on, has the exchange rate worked? And he kind of concluded that all of the literature to which he had contributed was really not that important, because by 1991 the U.S. current account deficit had gone to zero, actually by 1990. So I said, I recommend his essay. It's very clear. He also discusses the McKinnon-Mundell global monetarist view. So for the earlier question on that, you could consult this essay by Paul. But probably he was jumping the gun on this because the recovery of the U.S. current account, if you look at the data, was extremely temporary. Okay, let me come to my variant 6. These first variants were sort of accomplished by the late 1980s, and roughly a decade later, in the mid to late 1990s, another variant arose, which is the idea of local currency pricing. So this is related to pricing to market. Agnès pointed out to me in an email a couple of days ago that this focus on the denomination of imports and exports in terms of currencies on the invoice currency actually was discussed in considerable detail by Joan Robinson. So I give her credit here for this. And the basic idea here is the following. So, in the typical Mundell-Fleming model, export prices are set in domestic currency and are sticky, so that when a country's currency depreciates, other countries with whom it trades finds that those exports are cheaper. On the other hand, import prices symmetrically are set in the source country's currencies. And when the importer's currency depreciates, the domestic currency price of imports rises fully in proportion to the depreciation. In other words, the degree of pass-through of the exchange rate is 1. And this makes the exchange rate a powerful way of adjusting international prices. Whether this also leads to the desired adjustment in the trade balance will depend on the strength of trade elasticities. But the local currency pricing view states that, in fact, exporters invoice exports in terms of the importing country's currency. And in this case, an exchange rate change does not alter the relative prices of either imports or exports. And this limits their ability to promote trade adjustment or to affect aggregate demand. An exporter's profits will change. So if I am pricing in terms of suppose I'm a US exporter selling to Japan and I price in yen and the dollar depreciates against the yen, then my yen sales are worth many more dollars. And so my profits will go up if my costs are sticky in terms of dollars. And this may lead to entry or exit over time, but this is different from the view that the Mundell-Fleming model takes. So some papers by Betts, Devereux, Engel propose this. It's been explored by them and further by Corsetti, Dodola, Leduc, others. And it can have very different welfare implications about the exchange rate regime. And as I said, again, thanks to Agnès for this, Joan Robinson was an important precursor in thinking about these issues. Now, two things about local currency pricing. Even if it holds at the consumer level, it seems to hold less at the level of intermediate imports and even consumer good imports at the dock. So the scope empirically seems to be limited. And the work of Gita Gopinath and others that I will talk about later, which looks more directly at invoicing, also indicates that it's limited. So this was an important concept, but it seems to be not critical empirically in my view. Okay, variant 7, exchange rates at the effective lower bound. This is, of course, a post-financial crisis. Well, we can't really refer to the great financial crisis anymore without a modification such as the last great financial crisis, because we may well be in the next great financial crisis. So when I refer to the global financial crisis, I do mean the last one. But nice paper by Cook and Devereux show that if you can't credibly commit monetary policy going forward, home demand shocks can actually be destabilizing at the effective lower bound when exchange rates float. And a paper I worked on at the IMF with a large number of co-authors, 2016, makes this point also for Japan. When we try to sort of rationalize why it is for Japan that depreciations of the yen are so damaging. So imagine the deflationary domestic shock. If we are in a world where more or less real interest parity holds, then we can iterate forward the interest parity relationship, which links the expected change in the real exchange rate to the real interest differential. And in this equation, Q is a country's real exchange rate. When Q rises in my notation, the real exchange rate depreciates, not appreciates. And R star is the foreign real rate of interest, R is the domestic real rate of interest. And so when we look at this equation, where I've surely made a sign error in the second bit of this, but just look at the first bit of this. If we imagine a home deflationary shock, this will raise the home rate of interest, which is R, and this will lead Q to fall, which is a real appreciation. And this will hurt the home economy. So the flexible exchange rate here is actually destabilizing. On the other hand, if you look at this equation, and this Corsetti et al. Make this point, and imagine that the rest of the world, and again, look at the first line here, which is the one where I did not make a sign error. If you imagine that the rest of the world is at the effective lower bound and there is a deflationary shock there, then their real interest rate will go up and our currency will depreciate, Q will rise, and that will be stabilizing in that it will insulate us from the foreign deflationary shock. So whether we want to take Cook and Devereux seriously or not is dependent on where the shock originates. What I would argue is that this actually is an argument not for a pegged exchange rate, but for a temporary peg when there are destabilizing shocks. And in fact, this is what Switzerland did in 2011 to 2015. It's something the Czech Republic did when they capped their exchange rate. It's very much related to the Svensson argument in the early 2000s that Japan should address its deflation trap by depreciating the currency. So I would say this is an argument for managed floating and not a fixed exchange rate. Okay. Global value chains is another argument that has come up more recently. So let me sort of describe what this argument is. Imagine that your exports incorporate significant import content. This would be related to China. Maybe that's what someone wanted to ask about. Then when your currency depreciates, it can raise the price of imports and limit the extent of your competitiveness gain, which will imply only to your value added. So this is sort of a backward linkage argument. But there's also a forward linkage argument that, if a depreciation lowers my export prices and other countries import my exports and incorporate them into their sales to me, that will lower the price of imports and make the foreign country more competitive at the same time. And so this forward linkage will lower the rise in my import prices. So in the paper, I do a very simple two-country example, but I think it's more generally applicable. So suppose that net exports are basically the domestic price of, these are net exports in domestic currency, price of exports times volume of exports minus price of imports times volume of imports. And these elasticities, epsilon sub x, epsilon sub m, reflect the change in the domestic price of exports and imports with respect to DE, the exchange rate. Then if we have full pass-through of the exchange rate to importers, this expression gives the effect of a currency change on the ratio of net exports to GDP. Now let me reproduce this on the next page so you can have it in front of you. In the absence of global value, let me also say that the, eta X and eta M are respectively the traditional export and import elasticities that are in the textbooks with respect to the exchange rate. Under Mundell-Fleming type of assumptions. So if epsilon x is 0, if my export prices don't depend on the exchange rate, which is the Mundell-Fleming assumption, if exchange rate pass-through into import prices is unity, which is also the Mundell-Fleming assumption, then this expression boils down to this, which is the standard Marshall-Lerner condition. What do we see here? Well, there are actually two sets of effects in this expression. There's the dampening effect of the global value chain effect on export prices, which is this term here. So this term is lower. And you also see this in terms of import prices and pass-through. This is the backward linkage effect, which is here. So if epsilon x is greater than 0 and epsilon m is less than 1, these effects are smaller. But also there are sort of J-curve effects because this epsilon x reflects the fact that my export prices are raised slightly by a depreciation, so that raises pxx. And similarly, there's the import J-curve effect. Import prices fall, so that's this effect. So in effect, there are ambiguous effects here. It's not totally clear which way they cut. And in fact, if you look at the expression, if the traditional trade elasticities are both relatively low, less than 1, then global value chains will enhance the effect of an exchange rate change on net exports. So if you believe that, if you're a sort of traditional elasticity pessimist, then you would conclude that global value chains actually increase the efficacy of an exchange rate change. Now, the other point that's really important, and this is made by Gustavo Adler and co-authors in a IMF paper from last year, is that, when you have global value chains, the volume of exports and imports, this should say X and M, not X and Y, the volumes actually expand, and this is empirically a very strong relationship. So, coming back to this expression at the top, X rises and M rises, and that will increase the effect overall on net exports and therefore on aggregate demand. And what they conclude, Adler et al., is that these effects kind of balance out, so that you can't say that global value chains have decreased the efficacy of the exchange rate. Okay, we're sort of in a marathon here, and there are 2 more to go, so I'll try to go through fairly quickly, so that we can get to more Q&A. The global financial argument is made most powerfully by Ellen Ray, and she, contra Friedman, says, no, global financial markets, the element that was not present in Friedman, lead to very powerful transmission of global financial conditions, regardless of whether the exchange rate is fixed or more flexible. And therefore, the true trade-off is not between the exchange rate, openness, and internal stability. It's really between openness and internal stability, with the exchange rate not being able to help you very much, and therefore the trilemma becomes a dilemma. She also argues that the global cycle is largely driven by the dominant currency country, which is the US, and is consistent with a growing body of work. Bruno and Shin in the JME is an early contribution here, which views the strength of the US dollar as a bellwether of global liquidity. And we're learning a lot about this and the relation of the dollar strength to issues like deviations from covered interest parity. There's a lively literature on, is there a global financial cycle? For example, Cerruti, Klessens, Rose see it in asset prices, not in capital flows. So I would make, one main point, which is that, regardless of the efficacy of the exchange rate, interest rate independence is key, and flexible exchange rates provide the extra degree of freedom that Johnson mentioned by allowing variability in the monetary policy interest rate. Okay, now if these rates are stuck at 0, we come back to the the Cook and Devereux argument. But I would argue that in that case, intervention can be effective, and also QE can be effective. Let me make some caveats here. One of the interesting empirical features of the world is that while there's a lot of room for short-term rates to move when exchange rates are flexible, longer-term nominal rates are more highly synchronized, and this is very much in line with the global financial cycle view. And moreover, short-term interest rates are not a sufficient statistic for overall financial conditions, and financial stability implications are quite important. But I would argue that the way to think about Ellen Ray's critique is to say, look, in a closed economy, policymakers have a trade-off between macro stability and financial stability. In an open economy, as well as a trade-off between price and macro employment stability, In an open economy, these trade-offs can become harsher. And so this may justify either macroprudential policy or some form of capital controls. And moreover, in an open economy, macro-pru may be harder in the absence of capital controls. And this is related to Dirk Schoenmaker's work on the financial trilemma. Empirically, in this chart, I sort of divide the main emerging market countries into those with more flexible regimes and those with more managed regimes. And among those with more managed regimes, I include crawling pegs, which actually involve a fair degree of flexibility. And one very strong empirical relationship is that if you look at the sort of shocks to growth as measured by revisions to IMF growth forecasts and correlate them with the change in the real exchange rate, where here an appreciation of the real exchange rate is an increase, you find that for these more flexible regimes, it is indeed the case that negative output shocks lead to depreciations, and positive output shocks lead to real, well, much smaller and insignificant real depreciations. So, I think this to my mind is fairly strong evidence of a stabilizing effect of more exchange rate flexibility. This doesn't negate the points made by Ray, but it indicates to me that there is indeed a noticeable trilemma. Okay, finally, dominant currency pricing. This again harks back to Joan Robinson and the local currency pricing debate. And it comes from work by Linda Goldberg and Cédric Thiel and Gita Gopinath, showing that pricing in dominant currencies, mainly the euro and even more so the dollar, is very, very prevalent. Now, this is a choice. It is endogenous, but it does affect the transmission mechanism of exchange rates. And moreover, Gopinath argues that not only do countries tend to price their exports in terms of a dominant currency in many cases, but prices are sticky for a long time in that dominant currency. We have to worry about endogeneity here, but there are macro implications. For example, if you're a non-US country and you face dollar import prices, then you would see full pass-through, as in Mundell-Fleming. If you invoice your exports in dollars, then a depreciation of your currency won't make your exports more competitive if you depreciate against the dollar. Since imports are often invoiced in dollars, that's where a lot of the adjustment occurs, though actually not all of it, because if you go back to the expression I derived in thinking about global value chains, if you price your exports in dollars and the dollar, your currency depreciates against the dollar, then the domestic currency value of your exports will rise, and that's a positive J-curve effect on your trade balance. There's also the issue of profitability and entry that comes up under LCP, which may aid adjustment. And the US is very asymmetric in this respect because its exports become more competitive when the dollar falls. Nothing much happens on the import side. There's very little pass-through. There are very interesting implications of this approach. There's a nice paper by Gita and Pierre-Olivier Gorinchas and Emine Boz and several other authors, too many to mention, on this. But one of the points of this is that globally, a strengthening of the dollar may hurt countries that invoice their exports in dollars, and so could be a channel for contractionary monetary policy by the U.S. to spread to emerging markets. And there are a number of papers that mention this possibility. One empirical indication is that, even for the European Union, which hosts a dominant currency, the euro, there's a lot of invoicing in dollars. So if you look at extra EU imports by invoicing currency, Eurostat data shows that 52.9% of imports, 32.3% of exports are invoiced in dollars. And interestingly, the difference between import invoicing and export invoicing is fully accounted for by the fact that energy imports by the EU and everyone tend to be invoiced in dollars. So, leaving out the energy, roughly a third of EU exports and imports are in US dollars. If you thought that dominant currency pricing is really very prevalent, then you would sort of make the following prediction. Let's take two countries, let's say Mexico and the United States, okay? Mexican exports are invoiced in, suppose Mexican exports are invoiced in dollars, as dominant currency pricing says. Suppose we know that US exports tend to be invoiced in dollars. We would therefore argue that there should be very little relationship between the peso dollar bilateral exchange rate and the relative competitiveness of Mexican and US exports, right? This is something that actually Rudy looked at in his 1987 paper on pricing to market. But actually, when we look at this data and look at the correlation between relative export price indices and nominal exchange rates, it tends to be super high. In fact, you can track it over time as a sort of trailing moving average, the correlation coefficient, and it's pretty close to 1. If we look at Singapore relative to the US, there's also a fairly high correlation. If we look at Korea relative to the US, with the Korean won subject to very high swings in the Asian crisis and in the last global financial crisis, the generally small. So, to my mind, this is an empirical puzzle to be explained if we take the dominant currency pricing view, as gospel. And, could be this is a reverse causation, that relative competitiveness of exports drives the exchange rate. But we also know there are a lot of other shocks out there, so this doesn't seem to me to be a likely explanation, but I think this is an area for further research. Okay, well, let me conclude and sum up so that we have some time for questions. One point that Johnson made that I think has been borne out is that if you have a fixed exchange rate, it is generally vulnerable to attack. Even the Hong Kong currency peg has been attacked. And so fixed exchange rates are rarely credibly fixed. And that is the reality that defines the true counterfactual. I think that the data shows, and the revealed preference of even emerging markets shows, that countries feel they reap benefits from having an added degree of freedom, even if they don't have full floating, that they have the option not to draw a line in the sand with a pegged exchange rate. And so intervening can help. So I argue that the demise of exchange rate flexibility is an exaggeration. And I like to quote or paraphrase Winston Churchill on this, who I mentioned before. Churchill was an important figure in 20th century exchange rate history, not only because of the consideration in the early 1950s of his cabinet of floating sterling and of the balance of payments crises that Britain went through, but also because of his decision, his fateful decision to return Britain to gold in 1925. That's a decision that had global consequences, not only very negative consequences for Britain, which by 1932, Churchill recognized, saying, it, meaning the gold standard, has been used as a vile trap to destroy us. And so, to paraphrase something else Churchill said in the 1950s, it's been said that exchange rate flexibility is the worst currency system, except for all those others that have been tried from time to time. And so with that, I will stop sharing the screen and
thank you very much.
Thank
you very much. So there are already some questions that arrived in written form, and then I will give the floor to some other ones. So there was a question directly related to the global value chains. How do you take into account big monopolies like Amazon? I know there is some research about trade elasticities with data from Amazon. So how, because the pricing is quite strategic in the different countries. So this is one question. And then there are a number of questions about the cost of flexibility, because you didn't mention much the cost. So there was an initial question by Gilles Saint-Paul about PPP, because if flexibility leads, it may be useless because you have, but it's not harmful if there is no cost of flexibility, that you don't care, PV, whatever you do. So then there must be a cost. And also, you didn't mention this literature about fear of floating, the fact that a number of emerging countries, because they have debt in foreign currency or they have exports in foreign currency, that they want to limit the volatility of their exchange rate. So how do you take these into account, these arguments into account, and also when you have a big symmetric shock like COVID, flexibility will not really help. So perhaps you could already take this group of questions, and then I will give the floor to those who raise their hands.
Yeah. Let me try to take these in reverse order. I should have had a pad here, Candy. I didn't write everything down, but I'll try to cover as much as I can remember. In terms of COVID, it is a symmetric shock. However, the effects of on different countries can be different depending on their response, and even if output responses are similar in the short run, the prospects for containing disease and therefore the longer term effects on output and employment may be very different. So from the standpoint of emerging markets, we've seen their currencies depreciate, basically as as capital flows have retracted in the face of worries about default and other forms of economic distress. And you have to ask, what would have been the cost to these countries if they had to try to, sorry, people should please mute if you're not.
Please unmute yourself. If you could mute yourself. Yeah, thanks.
Okay. If these countries had to peg their exchange rates in the face of this retraction of capital flows, by raising interest rates or by using up all of their reserves, that would have been very, very disruptive. So I think, on the contrary, the adjustment to the shock shows the benefit of flexibility.
But then would you say the same for the euro area?
I think the euro area is in a category by itself. I mean, it's you know, at this stage, it's hard to discuss the counterfactuals because there's so many sunk costs. You know, if you're Italy and you're getting limited support from other countries, you know, it could conceivably, you know, in a different world have been helpful. I mean, I think we would have seen in a world where we didn't have fixed exchange rates in Europe, and the shock, the lira would have depreciated, and the Spanish peso would have depreciated. I think that's pretty clear relative to the Deutschmark. You know, would that have been helpful? Yeah, probably at some level. You know, I think you know, this shock is also very different in that. You know, let me just sort of, you know, take a little time on this. We issued a Peterson brief at the Peterson Institute in a couple of weeks ago, just before the bank fund meetings. And the argument that we made there for industrial countries is that exchange rate variability is actually a fairly limited value in a situation where countries are basically shutting down their economies. So, you know, your impact on the export sector is going to be very limited during a lockdown. And so what we thought was the major priority in thinking of the development of exchange rates is to prevent a very sharp depreciation, very sharp appreciation of the US dollar. Not because we thought this would hurt US exports, but we thought it might have a very negative effect on emerging markets in terms of these fear of floating issues that were raised in the question. So what we actually recommended in that is not that emerging markets intervene in case of a very sharp dollar appreciation, but that industrial countries, and particularly the US, think about intervening in such cases. So there we were pointing to one of the possible negative effects of a flexible dollar, but arguing for managing it, not for pegging the dollar exchange rate, you know, for all time necessarily. You know, coming back to the fear of floating issues, you know, when I went through that initial slide, which was a long time ago in the lecture of things Johnson got wrong, you know, I did focus on the fact that exchange rate movements can be subject to speculation and financial pressures, and certainly that would also entail sort of risk-on behavior in markets, which lead to inflows to emerging markets, and then are followed by risk-off episodes where the outflows and the sharp depreciation might lead to negative balance sheet effects. So this is why I also endorse the idea that, you know, you don't necessarily want free floating. Some degree of intervention is practiced by these countries for fear of floating reasons that are quite justified. You know, on the question of Amazon, you know, Amazon is clearly a discriminating monopolist. Pricing to market is based on price discrimination across countries. You know, there can also even be on these online platforms price discrimination across individual consumers. So it's not really a global value chain issue. I think it's more of a pricing to market, you know, general pricing to market issue. And yeah, you know, it is one of these very strong manifestation of pricing to market. I may have missed some other of the questions, but I think I covered, you know, probably the bulk of what you asked. If there's some others though that we should come back to them, you should remind me.
Thank you. So we have now two relatively long questions, so I may give the floor to maybe in a row so that you then respond as a group to Vinay Sharma, to Francesco, to Jorge Fauzi, and to François Giraud.
Yeah, hello?
Yes.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to ask, regarding the role of China, because it is considered that, this flexible rate has benefited China because they have been able to maintain the manufacturing monopoly, and most of their reserves are going into US treasuries and all, So it is somewhat, not that productive also, and a lot of countries are dependent on China only for their supply chains and all, So it is not that, that all the countries of 200 nations, have really benefited from this, system, and even the financial flows and everything is completely, distorted at this point of time. So how do you maintain the balance, with this current system? Because in nearly 80%, 70% of the manufacturing is completely, and even the capital and, financial flows are dependent on China only, and so how do you maintain that, how do you maintain the balance, because this issue is going to become very dominant in the future, because a lot of jobs and inequality is going to, these issues will crop up.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Maybe if you can hold a minute, we ask Francesco.
Let me just grab a pen and paper so I can. Okay, just so I can make a note. Yes. Okay.
Francesco?
Yes, so Maurice, I was just wanted to ask if there is substitutability for the instruments, the policy instruments, because if you look at the adoption of the fixed exchange rate regimes, it seems like after the WTO agreement, there has been an increase in the, at least going towards more fixed regimes, which is not only due to the euro area. So I was wondering whether there is also this substitutability between the trade policy that you can actually use. And so once you lose the possibility to use trade policy, it seems like there is more tension towards using the exchange rate regime and fixed regime as an instrument.
Okay, now we have...
there is a question by Francois, maybe if you,
Francois,
if you want to ask the question directly.
Sure. Yes, so I wanted to ask, do you think that there is a relation between fixed exchange rate and current account imbalances? You know, we've seen a lot of instances where there's a fixed exchange rate and there is a current account deficit because it allows the financing, easier financing of current account deficits, real exchange rate appreciation, and so on. This has also happened in the Eurozone. So do you think that's another difference between fixed and flexible exchange rate potentially? Mm-hmm.
Okay, and we have Jorge Fauzi. So maybe later on. Please, Maurice.
Okay, on China, the the critique of China is that they manipulated their currency, that they prevented the natural adjustment that would have occurred with a flexible yuan, and that promoted the what you characterized as a misallocation of resources and the the migration of a lot of manufacturing to China. So the China's trading partners in the U.S. and Europe have especially the U.S. have long pushed for a more flexible, more market-oriented yuan exchange rate. The interesting question now is, how will that relationship evolve in the coming years after this pandemic? What we had been seeing is some degree of reshoring driven by technology and some migration of sort of lower tech manufacturing out of China to countries like Vietnam. And for me, a major question is, will the aftermath of the COVID epidemic lead to more reshoring? A, because of just security concerns, and B, because of security in the sense of securing the supply chain from shocks, but also security in the sense of heightened tensions between China and other countries, and maybe between other blocs such as the U.S. and the Eurozone. And where China's exchange rate policy comes into this picture is very hard to say. I mean, the Chinese leadership clearly is willing to embrace more limited flexibility, but want to maintain a considerable degree of control over the exchange rate, partly for political purposes. And it may be that the rest of the world is just not willing to tolerate this any longer in the current environment, and that we have more trade warfare, more trade disagreements. So the China issue is fascinating and subject to a lot of uncertainty. In terms of the evolution of exchange rate regimes, there are a number of classifications you can look at, like the recent Ilzetsky, Reinhardt, and Rogoff. And I think that the recent trend is not to more fixed regimes, but to more managed float regimes, which I would characterize as largely being flexible regimes, though in some cases crawling pegs. What is the role of the trade system in all this? I tend to think that what is more important is the role of financial flows and the desire of countries to allow the exchange rate to somewhat be to sort of limit the exchange rate's response to financial flows, which can be financially destabilizing. So I don't see much of a link with necessarily the WTO system. More generally, the WTO, the coming of the WTO in the mid-1990s coincided with a lot of liberalization by emerging markets, some emerging markets in many respects, and it may be that this system gave them more confidence that they would, richer countries would follow some rules in interacting with them. And I think as the WTO system has come into more attack by the United States, its reliability is in question. And interestingly, its Director General Azevedo has just announced his intention to step down, and so it'll be interesting to see where the new leadership comes from and how they can navigate the current environment. On fixed rates and current account imbalances, one of the arguments that Milton Friedman made early on is that basically a floating rate would quickly eliminate trade imbalances, and of course in a world of capital mobility, that need not be the case, and it has not been the case. And we've seen very protracted current account imbalances, even in a world of floating exchange rates. It's really unclear what the counterfactual is on this. When I did my first paper for the Brookings Institution in 1985, in Brookings papers, the editor, George Perry, wanted me to look at how the US current account deficit, which had then become extremely large because of the floating dollar, which was very strong at the time, how that would have been different in the counterfactual world where the US pegged the dollar. And it was very difficult to say how that would have worked out. So I think you can make arguments either way, but clearly we've had large imbalances with floating rates. Within the Eurozone, even larger imbalances, but that also due to a higher degree of financial integration with a single central bank and the target system. So, I don't have a definitive answer on that.
So unfortunately, I think time has is running out, and so we have to finish to stop this conversation. Although I see there are new questions, but unfortunately, it's going to be too long. We need to free you for your day. So thanks very much. I think we can organize e-upload. We learned a lot, and it's a fantastic overview of all the topics and thoughtful, thoughtful review with, and all the references are, I suppose, in the end of the paper. So
Yes.
yeah, so it will be interesting to dig into this in the coming weeks. Thank you very much indeed for accepting to give this lecture.
Well, thank you all, and have a very good and safe evening. And I hope you're all managing as we are here in the circumstances. But it's great to be able to interact in this way. And who knows? Maybe we'll have less air travel and more seminars in the future.
Yeah. That's right, and on our side, it's fantastic to be able to attend seminars anywhere in the US or in other places with while staying at home. So I think it's going to change the way we interact, definitely.
Yeah, I know. I couldn't say that. I can't come to Paris in May, so I can't do this. There's no more excuses, right? Everyone has to say yes to everything.
Yeah, I had kept all your emails, so
Right.
I could come back.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you for this opportunity, and
Thank
good
you,
luck,
and
everyone.
hopefully we'll see
Maurice.
you nevertheless in Paris in some months.
Well, I'm looking forward to when I can come. I have a family there, and they've all been locked up, and we send WhatsApp messages. But I also want to see them. So as soon as I can get there, I will come.
You're welcome.
Great.
You're always
Okay.
welcome.
Great. Thank you.
Bye bye. Bye bye, everybody. Thanks for being
Bye.
here.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Maurice.